Should Nick Caserio be looking to trade Brandin Cooks? Does Brandin Cooks want to be traded? What is the value? Who benefits? And if he's moved, what's the next move for the Houston Texans? Let's jump right into it. Should Caserio be looking to trade Brandin Cooks? The answer to that really depends on what Brandin Cooks wants. If Brandin Cooks wants to be traded, then yes, you need to trade Brandin Cooks, because part of the appeal of Brandin Cooks is he's one of the faces of this rebuild. He's one of those, quote, culture guys. He's a guy that is supposed to be a leader on this team. He's supposed to be a guy that sets an example for other players. So if Brandin Cooks wants to be traded, you might have no other option if you're Nick Caserio than to trade Brandin Cooks. And Brandin Cooks, while he's a good player, it's not like a Deshaun Watson situation where you just hold off, and keep your fingers crossed that maybe he's going to stay. Brandin Cooks isn't on that level. Let's look at the Twitter feed of Brandin Cooks because this was interesting. And this was days after he voiced his sadness upon the departure of Jack Easterby. This has been making rounds around Texans Reddit. Shout out to Texans Reddit. Brandin Cooks So there are some context clues that maybe Brandin Cooks isn't satisfied with the Texans. And if that's the case, because he's not a clear-cut number one wide receiver in the league, and because part of the appeal of him is his leadership, maybe Nick Caserio should be looking to trade Brandin Cooks. And I want to kind of dig more into what I mean by the leadership thing matters, because I think Brandin Cooks, if he gets traded somewhere, I think Brandin Cooks can go to that team, put his head down, and just produce. He's produced his entire career. He can go and be just a guy somewhere in Green Bay or wherever. He can just go handle his business, produce, and be fine in doing it. But in this situation, if you've been one of the culture guys and you've been one of these guys that has been picked by Caserio and whoever else to be a leader, can you all of a sudden be disgruntled and change your entire temperament? Maybe you can, but is it really worth it? And furthermore, if Brandin Cooks, if his happiness with the Houston Texans is that tied to Jack Easterby to where he's not going to be able to produce the same or be able to go about his business the same way, then let him go. Let him go. The other thing about it is maybe it has nothing to do with Jack Easterby. Maybe Brandin Cooks just realizes Davis Mills isn't that good of a quarterback. The production's down. Brandin Cooks has 17 more targets than Nico Collins, and Nico Collins has more receiving yards. Maybe Cooks got tired of losing. I don't know. He seemed pretty okay with winning 4 games before the Easterby thing. Like, we weren't even talking about this till now. And there was a time when Brandin Cooks said he wasn't going to take a trade no matter what. But let's pretend that Brandin Cooks wants to be traded and or the Texans want to trade him. What's the value for a Brandin Cooks? He's still in his 20s. The contract's not great, but it's not awful, especially if he produces like he has for the majority of his career. What's the value? Texans got him for a second-round pick. That was about market value a few years ago. That wasn't like a steal. I heard John McClain today say that was a great deal. It wasn't a hell of a deal. It was a market value deal. But what is the value for Brandin Cooks now? It's damn sure not a second. If you can get a second for Brandin Cooks, trade him yesterday. If a team gets that desperate, second, and they want, trade him yesterday. I got to think you're looking at a fourth or a third for Brandin Cooks. Is that worth it? If he wants to go, I think it's worth it. Because here's the other thing. The Texans need to make, even if Brandin Cooks is going to stay here, the Texans in the next couple of years need to find a new number one receiver. They need to find a receiver better than Brandin Cooks. And in an ideal world, that means that you have a rookie on a rookie contract. And when Brandin Cooks' contract is up, his contract extension, then that means that it's then time to pay that rookie and you can let Brandin Cooks go. Now, if Brandin Cooks leaves, obviously you're going to need a new number one receiver. However, you're going to need someone that can be a solid number two receiver because we don't know about Nico Collins. So you're going to need that caliber of receiver. But regardless, wide receiver has to be very high up on the Texans list. And fortunately for them, this is a really good wide receiver draft. You have Boutte out of LSU. You have Smith and Jigba out of Ohio State. You have Johnson out of TCU, and then you have Addison out of USC. There's some really good. That Browns first-round draft pick, you might be using that on a wide receiver. So wide receiver's up there. We've listed a lot of needs. Wide receiver might be where the Texans go. It'll definitely be where they go if they get rid of Cooks, but even if they get Cooks, I think they should be looking at that to build a team around him. Who benefits from a trade? If the Texans do trade Brandin Cooks, I think Brandin Cooks would benefit because he'd be able to get more of a better atmosphere, and the Texans would have more draft equity. Already got over a dozen picks in the upcoming draft. They would get more draft equity. But if Cooks wants to be here, it's a moot point. Because I don't think they're just going to actively try to trade him. So the verdict of this whole thing, should the Texans trade Brandin Cooks? Should Nick Caserio be looking to trade Brandin Cooks? I would say no. I would say no, as long as he wants to be here. But if he wants to go, kick rocks. You're supposed to be a culture guy. You're supposed to be more than, just a receiver. You're supposed to be buying in. If Brandin Cooks is moping around because Jack Easterby's gone, Lovey said it, I think, 16 times now. Sometimes divorce can be a good thing. And if Brandin Cooks doesn't want to be the Brandin Cooks that he's been the last couple of years, best of luck to him. See you at the draft. Nice knowing you. Best of luck. But he can ball. So if he wants to stay, we shall see. The other thing that I keep hearing about this is, well, you're giving Davis Mills an unfair shake. Davis Mills doesn't impact any decision this organization makes at this point. If Davis Mills plays himself into being the starting quarterback next year because the Texans want to focus on other stuff, more power to him. But if you think trading Brandin Cooks is in the best interest of the team, shout out to Bill O'Brien, capital T, capital E, capital A, capital M, make the trade. This isn't Deshaun Watson. It's not a franchise quarterback. And I would like to hope that the front office, sometimes we act like Nick Caserio, Scout Goodhair, James Lifford are jamokes like us that are looking at the stat sheet and saying, oh, well, he had this many yards, that many yards, that many yards, so he must be this. Like they're fantasy football players or something. Like someone in your fantasy football league. These guys know how to look past the gray area. They know how to look at the gray area, take a look at it. So if they trade Brandin Cooks and Davis Mills falls off, they're going to evaluate that the right way. So my verdict, I wouldn't do it unless he wanted to. But if you can get a second, that might change a lot of things But we don't know what Brandin Cooks wants, but there are some hints he might want out of town. Subscribe to the channel. Follow on Twitter and Instagram at Landry Locker. Listen Monday through Friday, 10 to 2 on Sports Radio 610. Fire up that Odyssey app. Keep the comments, keep the questions coming. Thank you very much. Enjoy watching the Pigskin. Couple days away from some Astros baseball. Life is good. We're all in this together.